Cool. Yeah, something weird just happened when one of my monitors just blacked out when I shared screen, so that kind of freaked me out a little bit, but I think I'm good to go. So like Tony said, this is Almost Famous, How Wealth Shocks Impact Career Choices. This is with my two friends and co-authors, Jacelly Cespedes at Minnesota and Carlos Parra at Puck Chile. And thank you, Tony, for including this for discussion today. So what do we do in this paper? Well, the main motivation for this paper is the collapse of housing prices in the Great Recession. And which led to a great decline in household wealth. And maybe in a couple of years, what we're going to be studying is the general wealth transfers that happened during the COVID crisis. But this paper was focused on the Great Recession. And so far, the literature has really explored how housing wealth shocks affect labor supply, on-the-job productivity, and labor mobility. And there are a variety of authors that have contributed to this literature. And what we want to think about in this paper is we think it's important to consider how these wealth shocks can affect other margins of adjustments, such as the characteristics of the jobs that you take on and the match quality between the employee and the job opportunity. And so again, I think this has hopefully potential implications with the COVID crisis and during the recovery, as people come out of the recovery and as they're trying to look for jobs again, how their wealth and safety net circumstances impact the job characteristics that they take on afterwards, and how this might impact the economy overall. So in standard job search models, wealth is typically a safety net that allows workers to be more selective and wait for the best opportunities. And that's what we're really trying to test in this paper. However, there are a variety of challenges to testing these claims. First is we very rarely have in-depth data on job characteristics or the job quality of a particular opportunity. And second, if we do, even when we do have information on individuals' wealth, a lot of times career choices are going to be biased due to unobserved variables, health shocks, skill, etc. So, we need to find something that moves the individual's wealth. So what do we do in this paper? In this paper, we investigate the impact of wealth shocks on individuals' career decisions using the labor market for workers in the film industry. Now, we're going to ask several things. Do wealth shocks affect job characteristics? And what are the short and long-term career impacts of these wealth effects? So, the film industry provides us with a really interesting data set. Not only do we have the job histories, biographical information, and financial information about these active workers, we also have a way of really characterizing each of these opportunities, right? We can see ex ante what characteristics these individuals are selecting on. Are they working on bigger films or smaller films? Additionally, we're going to employ several empirical strategies that look at wealth shocks. So we're going to compare workers in the same county and occupation, but with different exposure to local house price changes. So you have certain neighborhoods that are going to be more or less exposed, and we're going to see how the people who live in those different neighborhoods react and how that affects their job choice behavior. And finally, we can even compare homeowners to renters in the response to their local house price changes using a difference in difference estimator. And hopefully what the renters allow us to do is to control for the demand side impact from the film industry during this same time period. So why do we choose the film industry? Well, we think it's a good laboratory for examining the career effects of wealth shocks. First, we're able to categorize each job that the individuals take by collecting information about the type of the project, information about the cast and the crew, information about the awards, information about the budget or the size of the project. Additionally, we're able to gather a lot of biographical information and match with other databases to determine residence, homeownership status, and a few other financial variables. Now, the one thing that we're cognizant of is the generalizability of our results. This setting allows us to make progress in testing these theoretical predictions on how wealth shocks should impact job search and quality matches. One of the nice things about the film industry is that individuals are working on a project by project basis. You're always trying to look for that next strip or that next opportunity to work on. So, our results are going to apply much more to workers whose compensations depend on the projects themselves and that are constantly searching. And this is going to be, related to kind of high skilled gig economy workers who are starting to represent a growing fraction of the economy. Or we can also think about, consultants or lawyers who, certain types of consultants or lawyers who kind of operate on a project by project basis. So what are our main findings? So just jumping into it, we find that homeowners with greater housing wealth losses are going to reduce their participation in films with award-winning cast and crew. They're also going to reduce their participation in films that are positively rated and films that win awards. However, they're going to increase their involvement in smaller productions. So it seems like there's a shift in the jobs that they take on. When we add renters in to control for local demand, we find that renters are not affected by these local house price shocks. So it doesn't seem like there is any feedback between, the film industry and into house prices that are shifting things for all people. And we also look at long-term effects. We find that there's evidence that these wealth shocks have adverse consequences on probability of landing leading roles 5 or 8 years out from the recession, on their popularity that far out, and on the overall film quality in the longer term. So in the final part of the paper, we're going to think about a few mechanisms that could describe our results, that fit with our results. And most of our results are consistent with limited liquidity by these different individuals. These negative effects are stronger for homeowners with less housing equity, and these negative house price shocks are going to affect these households' financial health. So we see that they're more likely to become delinquent. And we have some tests in the pre-crisis period, and then we also look at differences between recourse and non-recourse states to try to think about the stress hypothesis. So one of the overall points that we want to make is that during the Great Recession, housing wealth potentially did not function as an adequate safety net for all households. And this difference leads to differences in short-term career choices and also longer-term career trajectories. So let me next go into the data and the matching process that we did. So we collected data for active writers, actors, writers, and directors in the film industry. So we were able to do this by looking at film credit data, and we did this from year 2000 to 2018. And we have a lot of details for each project, like the crew members, the cast members, the crew size, the budget, the film rating, the awards, a whole laundry list of stuff that's more or less publicly available. And then we have some popularity and recognition score for each individual that we'll also use in this data. So we take this set of film industry data, and we're going to match this with public records using their full name and their date of birth. And this gives us a pretty good match for somebody. There's very few people with the exact same name and the exact same date of birth on a particular day. So we're going to identify homeowners and renters and their place of residence using these public records. And after we have your place of residence, we can match to Zillow and to the Zillow Home Value Index to proxy for changes in local home prices. And the public records also allow us to look at delinquency events, tax liens, etc. And we're going to manually verify a lot of these matches as well. So the research design, we're going to exploit these changes in house prices during the 2008 crisis as a proxy for wealth shocks. There's two main reasons that we do this. First, these shocks are well measured. And second, housing represents a substantial part of homeowners' wealth. I know there's some estimates that it's north of 60% of homeowners' wealth. The specification that we're going to look at first is we're just going to look at intensity of treatment. We're going to see how house price changes impact your career, your job decisions. So we're just going to regress the house price change. The second specification is going to look at homeowners versus renters. And this is going to be almost a difference in difference setup. We're going to use renters to serve as a control group since they face the same local labor opportunities. And it's going to hopefully address the concern that there's going to be certain shocks that drive both local house prices and local labor market opportunities. So what are the characteristics? What are the job characteristics that we focus on? Well, what we really want to consider are ex ante job characteristics that would be known as these individuals are agreeing to work on these film projects. So several of the things that we focus on is the talent that they decide to work with. We can see who the cast members are at the time of the project, right? If you're deciding to work on a project, is there an award-winning director? Are there other award-winning actors? Is there an award-winning writer on that crew? We can also observe things like the resources of the project, something like the budget that is set forth. And we can look at the role that you're going to play. If you're an actor, is this going to be a leading role, or are you going to be the fifth person down? And what we can also see are different characteristics related with project outcomes. So the box office of the different movies, the ratings that these movies get on average, and if these movies or these films win awards. Now, what we have to admit is that we don't have perfect coverage of all of this data. For example, we would love to have the detailed budget for every single project, but that's not available. And even just the rough budget number is not available for every project. So what we use instead is we use the crew size, which is very highly correlated with the budget of the film. So if you have a very large crew size, if you're a Marvel action movie, you're going to have thousands of people working on it. That's very related to the initial budget that's going to be proposed for that movie. So what are the short-term measures? Again, the ex-ante quality measures we're going to focus on is the cast and crew quality. So we're going to define this as high-profile films. That's productions with personnel nominated for important awards. This is Oscars and Golden Globes. We're going to also look at the resources or something correlated to the budget, right? We're going to separate large films from small films. And large films are films with crew size in the top quartile, and small films are going to be in the bottom quartile. And then we're also going to look at the type of job for the actors only, and we're going to look at if you're a leading role or not. And then the ex-post quality measures are going to be if the film wins an awards and what the average movie rating is. Some of the long-term outcomes that we can see are going to be the same type of outcomes in the short term, but also we're going to add to that the popularity ranking of these different actors, directors, and writers. Okay, so here are some summary stats. The main thing I want you guys to focus on is we have about 1,500 individuals in our sample that we're tracking. There's a distribution of actors, writers, and directors in our sample. They, have various, they have various popularity. They work on different number of films. There's, some heterogeneity here in this population. So the first thing I'm going to show you guys are some plots that really illustrate what we find. And so in these plots, what we have plotted is the intensity of treatment. So for any particular graph, the 20% bin represents those households that were most impacted by housing price losses. So they lost the most. And the omitted group is the set of individuals who lost the least in terms of housing wealth. So the 20% group, again, is the people who lost the most. And as we see from that first graph, they were much less likely to work on high-profile films. They're less likely to do a number of high-profile films. They're less likely to work on large motion pictures as well. But what we see in that final graph is that the number of small films that those people participate in is actually much higher than the baseline group. Again, just to reiterate how to view this graph, the 20% group is the people who lost the most in terms of housing wealth, proxied by the Zillow Housing Wealth Index. And the control group, the red line, is going to be the people who did not experience the least amount of house price decline, or maybe even a small gain in their house wealth. And so previously, those were the ex ante characteristics, the selection of, what they knew before they signed on. This These figures show kind of some of the ex post characteristics of these projects. These projects that were worked on for the people who had the most house wealth loss tended to be a little bit worse on average, right? They were less likely to win major awards. The movie ratings were on average lower, and they were less likely to be offered leading roles, or they were less likely to be a leading role when in those productions. Okay, so this is just the table form of those same graphs that I showed you, right? Again, what we're interested in is how housing wealth shocks impact their career decisions. And so in that first column, we just look at whether or not you're working on a project with other high profile talent. That's other talent that had won awards prior to 2007. And so what we find is that the more housing wealth you lose, the less likely you are to work with high profile talent. That's kind of what we see in columns 1 and 2. In column 3, what we see is that the overall number of films that you participate in is not significantly impacted. It's not that you're really is not that you're working a lot harder, you're doing a lot more. It's just that the composition seems to shift a little bit. And in columns 4 and 5, we separate out large films, which is in the top quartile, and small films, which is in the bottom quartile. And again, we see that if you lost a lot in housing wealth, you're less likely to participate in these large films, and you're more likely to participate in these smaller films. Okay, and this carries over again to some of the ex post characteristics. These films are less likely to win awards, the ratings are going to be a little bit lower, and you're less likely to be a leading role. So one of the natural questions that we considered is that local economic shocks could definitely drive both housing prices and can be driven by local housing prices and the local labor market opportunities. If there's a general shift in opportunities available for film industry people, and if film industry people all kind of cluster in the same areas of Los Angeles, let's say, then the house price is just going to reveal the labor market conditions. What we can do to help address this is to add renters to our specification and compare how local house prices impact renters versus homeowners. And so what we see is that the house price change interacted with the homeowner variable is what lights up. And it's that people who actually are experiencing these house price changes are the ones who are reacting, and not just in general people who are living in certain areas that might be close to Hollywood or might have a higher concentration of film industry workers. So again, this is additional evidence that these effects are driven by housing wealth changes and not local market opportunities. Another way to look at this is to think about how housing wealth is going to impact different homeowners. Right, for wealthier households, real estate assets are going to represent a lower fraction of their wealth, and presumably they might have other investments that they can use to help smooth consumption. Right, and so what we do is we look at people who have expensive homes versus people who don't have expensive homes. And how we measure that is if your home is valued at $2 million or more. And so if you look at that interaction there in the house price change times expensive homeowners, what you find is that effect is is the opposite sign of just the normal house price change impact. And we do another test where we look at individuals who own multiple properties as well. And what we find is that individuals who own multiple properties, again, are not as affected, and the signs seem to be the opposite of the significant effects that we see in the baseline results. So we've done a variety of robustness checks. We've done some alternative definitions. We've done stuff with non-overlapping periods. We've done some falsification tests. We've controlled for, the count variable nature of the film numbers. And we've also done some partial identification approach estimates. So the last thing that I'll show you before we move into the channels is going to be the longer term effects, right? What's nice about the our sample is that we're able to look kind of in 2008 to 2012, but we also have this, second period from 13 to 18 where we continue to track your movie trajectory. So, short-term decisions could impact their individual's career path, which has been understudied typically because we have lack of data. Typically, we can observe somebody when they're coming out of college or when they have, one financial event, and we have a snapshot. But here we're able to kind of look at the longer term. And so what we see is even the longer term, these house price changes that happened, closer to 2008 are going to impact your production from 2013 to 2018 in terms of high profile films, in terms of average ratings, in terms of leading roles, and it even affects your long run popularity. So there are a lot of potential channels for us to think through and for us to consider on, how exactly are these housing wealth shocks impacting these career decisions. And the two main ones that we're going to focus on are going to be limited liquidity and distraction. So under the limited liquidity story, negative housing wealth shocks reduce the likelihood of refinancing, which makes it more difficult to smooth shocks through equity extraction. And that's particularly important during the Great Recession when a lot of people, needed to, finance other things. You continue living on life, but if you need to borrow money or if you need money to, pay for school or other expenses, well, you might need to draw down your house. And if that's not available, then you're going to be impacted. So the prediction there is that these effects, the effects that we observe, are going to be stronger for those with less home equity. And also, we're going to expect to find increased participation in small and low quality productions, which have shorter shooting time to improve liquidity and improve financial distress. And on the second end, on the second channel, that's going to be the distraction channel. And that's been documented in the literature as well, where workers who experience these house price declines may be distracted by stress. They might be afraid that they're going to get foreclosed on, and so that might affect their ability to perform. And so what a prediction from that model would be that there would be a stronger effect for people living in recourse states, since lenders can seize assets not only just a home, but they can come after your car or other things that you might own. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at how much home equity you have, and we're going to proxy by this for if you have purchased your home relatively recently. So if you've purchased your home after 2000, you probably haven't had a significant amount of time to develop equity in your home before the financial crisis. And so that's what we use to proxy for home equity. And what we find is that most of our results come from that sample. So if you look at the interaction there, house price change really matters for those people who have less in home equity, who recently purchased their home. They're less likely to work on these high profile films, less likely to work on these large films. Right. And in this specification, we're excluding owners of expensive properties because, again, we found earlier that the people who own expensive properties just behave a whole lot differently than people who are more average. Additionally, we can look at how these house price changes lead to delinquency, right? If it's really a limited liquidity story, if I don't have enough money to, pay for my kid's school or for other things that come up in my life, then I might experience delinquency. And we measure delinquency looking at tax liens or non-tax liens or the number of tax liens. And what we find is that these house price changes do correlate with with these delinquency events, so that these house price losses are also accompanied by financial distress. So it seems like, these people who might have wanted to tap into their housing equity to help smooth out consumption or help smooth out their life events, they were not able to do so, and some of them were faced with pretty extreme duress. So the Next thing we'll look at is distraction. And to look at the distraction story, what we're going to do is we're going to look at recourse states versus non-recourse states. And if you live in a recourse state, and if the bank can come after other assets outside of just your home, you might be under more duress and feel, more stress about about um, about your housing situation. So if you look at house price change interacted with recourse, we don't see a super significant result there. And if anything, the result kind of goes the opposite way of what we would have expected, right? We would have expected that if it's recourse causing you to become distracted, that in recourse states, things were even more heightened, that house price changes were going to push you further away from high profile films, further away from large films. But, nothing is significant here, but everything, seems to point in the opposite direction. So, the findings, is that these adverse wall shocks are going to increase your participation in lower quality productions. Again, typically are more consistent with the limited liquidity channel that we have outlined. So just to conclude a few minutes early, so prior studies have documented a strong relationship between wealth and job search, unemployment, and the leisure and labor trade-off. Our paper is really going to focus on how wealth can impact the characteristics of employment, which is an important margin of adjustment. In addition, we find these career choices induced by wealth losses have persistent effects over time. So one of the takeaways is during the Great Recession, housing wealth did not function as an adequate safety net for all households. And in general, we view our results as easily generalizable to workers that are frequently searching for new jobs and opportunities, like gig economy workers or certain types of lawyers and consultants. And more broadly, our results are consistent with theories that predict that wealth and savings impact job search behavior. So I look forward to the discussion on chat, and I thank Raleigh for already posting some really interesting comments earlier this week.